Alright, so today I wanted to make a video going over my best long-range calibers. Now, as far as my criteria goes, I'm mostly worried, or at least put more emphasis on the ability to shoot accurately at long range as compared to power. Because again, if power is something you're really worried about, then you would probably change this up a little bit. But again, the main thing here is just sheer accuracy and convenience, I would say. And then power is also something you're worried a little bit about, but the main thing will be at just plain old accuracy, convenience, cost, the ease of shooting, that kind of stuff. So I always start out with some honorable mentions. Now, the first one I want to point out is not something that's the best long range caliber for sure, but it still deserves an honorable mention just because how cheap it is to shoot. And not to mention too, if you can, you should be able to shoot it fairly far out if you know what you're doing. And that's the 308. Now, the other thing here is that I have, these are all factory loads. So the first thing I need to point out with all of these things is that if you reload and you really know what you're doing, especially if you have a barrel with a fast twist, you can shoot the heavier bullets, you're going to be able to beat these numbers by a little bit. But again, just because you can push, this is another thing that I think a lot of amateurs don't really understand, is that just because you can push a bullet faster doesn't necessarily make it better, because if you're doing groups at 100 yards, 1,000 yards, wherever, the best one isn't always going to be the one that you can push the fastest. And the other thing to point out too is that the faster you push a bullet, at least when you get up past the recommended amount, it's going to become less reliable. So that's another thing to point out too, is that yeah, you may be able to get an extra 100 feet per second or 200 feet per second out of a specific load, but it's not going to be as reliable. And not to mention too, I think another important thing to point out too when it comes to long range shooting is that a lot of people get caught up on the newest fads. I think that they get caught up on the keeping up with the Joneses thing, is that they constantly want to change things up. And that the reality, I mean, here's another reality too, is that if you look at the history of sniper kills, this is a good example that I like to bring up, is that there's only been like 15 kills like in the entirety of history past, I think it's 1200 or 1250 meters, only like 15. And I think all but one or two of those were with 338, 338 caliber guns and up, most of them with 50s, I think. So again, these really long range, like I'm talking past 1,000 to 1,500, these guys that are shooting at 1,500 or 2,000, or these really far numbers, as cool as it is, it's not really realistic. Like real world, it's not really all that realistic, and it's not something that you're ever going to be doing real. It's pretty much a just to say you can do it kind of thing. It's pretty much a just to say you can do it thing. So the other last thing to point out too is that I think anybody who's done long range shooting would attest to this, is that it's more impressive to get a first round hit on a, let's say like a 10 by 10 or a 12 by 12 gong at 1,000 yards than it is to shoot like a 4 or 5 inch group at 1,000 yards. It because in my experience and in other people's experience from what I've heard, it's harder to get first round hits than it is to shoot really accurate groups. So again, those are the first things I wanted to point out. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that these will be calibers that are 30 cal and under, and the reason for that is, unless you're shooting at these extreme long ranges, which again, unless it's a military scenario, you really don't need that in it. Even if you look at the American military too, they recently changed the 50s being phased out, the 50 BMGs being phased out, at least as far as the sniper rifles go. So again, these really big calibers, they're not really being going to be used anymore because they're completely unnecessary. If you look at the U.S. military, I mean, they go through really extensive testing when it comes to picking these calibers, and recently they're changing to the 300 norm as their primary caliber. The 308 is going to be kept, I think, mainly for practice. May see a little bit of action, and then you got the 338 Norma for the anti, like, taking out engine blocks and punching through armor and stuff like that. So again, a lot of these guys, they have their 50s and the 338s and stuff, but the reality behind those calibers is that they're real world scenarios. They're really unnecessary. They're really unnecessary, especially if you're just shooting targets. Especially if you're just shooting targets. So that's kind of the first things I wanted to point out. So to get into the main calibers here, the two honorable mentions I would point out is number one, 308. Number one, because it's very cheap to shoot. It's the most available caliber, center fire caliber out there. As far as target shooting calibers, unless you would consider 223. Some people would, I guess. But as far as long range stuff, you're not using 223 for long range shooting. Um, and it's not as bad as what people think it is too. I mean, you look at this 185 grain burger load that Federal puts out. It is supersonic to about 1,300 yards, which is pretty impressive. Again, it's not gonna be super flat shooting out to that amount. I mean, if you compare it to a 6.5 here, a 308 is gonna have 10.4 mils of drop, and your 6.5 is going to have, let's figure it out here, um, 8.4. So again, you're significantly less, or sorry, a significantly flatter shooting cartridge. But again, the point being is that if you can shoot with a 308 at long range, then going to these other calibers is going to be really easy. And if you look at a lot of these guys, they have more than one gun. A lot of these guys have two, three, four, five different guns, right? Um, and you're if you have a 308, like I say, it's going to be the cheapest gun to shoot to, and not to mention you should be able to get it out to 800 to 1,000 yards, if you're good, right? If you're good, you should be able to do that. Now, it is not the most effective caliber cartridge by any means, which is why it is still an honorable mention. And again, the reason why I make it an honorable mention as well is that the U.S. military has clearly made it a priority as well, that it is still valuable to use for practicing. If they didn't think it was valuable, they would have completely phased it out, right? So the other honorable mention I would point out as well is the 6 millimeter or 243 loads. Those aren't great either. They're a little bit flatter shooting than the 308, which is good. The problem is that they haven't really been adopted in mass, so they're not quite as popular. So again, those are decent as well, especially if you're looking for a gun that has, like, if you had a muzzle brake, like literally next to no recoil, those would be good. But again, they still have their limitations, at least compared to these other really good calibers. So again, the honorable mentions I think would be a 308 and then the 6 millimeter calibers. Now, getting into it, the in third place I have the 7 millimeter Magnum. And again, this is a factory. Again, all of these are factory loads. So again, like I say, you're going to be able to get better ones. Now, the 7 millimeter Magnum in particular, if you reload, you're going to be able to get a lot better loads out of this, because the ballistic coefficient on this load, which is the best load I could find on Hordany, maybe Federal had a better one, but I forgot to look at Federal. It only has a 631 ballistic coefficient, but if you look at some of these higher end Sierra or Berger bullets in the 7 millimeters, they have ones that are upwards of 800, which is phenomenal for non like really the really big calibers. Like if you can get into the 700s, you're looking really good. The 800s is like absolute insanity levels of ballistic coefficient. So again, even with this subpar bullet out of a 7 millimeter, you're still getting it out to about 1,700 yards, um, supersonic. And again, the supersonic distance is basically the amount of yards or meters or wherever you're measuring it in. The supersonic zone is considered the effective range of a rifle, centerfire rifle bullet. Now, why is that? Is because when a bullet changes from the supersonic zone to the transonic zone, the bullet starts to, a lot of times it'll start to tumble and it'll become a lot more erratic and harder to predict where it's going to go, right? And not to mention too, if you're shooting at these distances, it's going to become really hard regardless of whether or not it's supersonic or not anyway. But once it becomes transonic, it becomes even that much harder. And again, this is one of the main reasons why, if you look throughout history, why there's so few kills from such a far distance. Now, part of it may be they just don't try it, but another thing is that it's so hard to predict what a bullet's going to do, right? Even if you have, even if it's your second, third, fourth shot, right? Because even a slight change in wind is going to be enough to throw you off. Um, so again, if you look at um, the the come up for this bullet, it is only 7.2 mils. So this is one of the main reasons why a 7 mm, the Magnum, is such a good caliber, is that it is a very, very flat shooting bullet, even compared to the 6.5 Creedmoor. It's even more flat shooting than that. So again, that's why I have the 7 mm on this list, is that I think it's one of the most underrated bullets because people don't realize just how good it is. I think people overlook it compared to a 30 cal. Like the 7 mm Magnum can perform as good as, if you're reloading, can perform as good as any of the 30 cal bullets. Maybe not the 300 Normas and the Ultra Mags, which I'm going to get into, but the 7 mm Magnum is very, very much underrated. The problem with 7 mm's that I've seen is that a lot of the factory barrels, they're rather slow twists. Like, there are a lot of like 1 in 11s and stuff like that, which would probably be hard to stabilize the heavier bullets, like the ones in the up in the 180s and the 190s. Because if you can get a 7 mm with a fast twist, then you could easily get out to 2,000 yards, supersonic, easily get out to 2,000 yards. Um, so again, that's something to point out with the 7 mm. The next ones to point out is the 300 calibers. Now, there's about 4 or 5 of them. I don't specify one of them because they're all fairly similar. They're all within like 5% of each other. They're all very close in that. The best one would probably be the 300 Norma. Again, the problem with that is that's probably the hardest one to get your hands on. 300 PRC is very good as well. 300 Ultra Mag would be very good as well. 300 Weatherby would be good as well, but though that's kind of hard to find as well. It's really only Weatherby that chambers those. And then you have the 300 Win Mag as well. The 300 Win Mag, the 300 Win Mag is good. I think the 300 Win Mag is underrated. A lot of people think that the 300 Win Mag is a significant step down from the 300 Norma and the PRC in those ones, but it's actually only a slight step down, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I mean, you look at the 300 Norma here, which is probably the best 30 cal and under round, at least as far as the effective range when you, and if you're looking for a gun that has a lot of power as well, because again, 300 Norma, you're looking at a little over 4,000 pounds of energy. That's about 500 more than a 300 Win Mag's got, so it's very good. But again, you look at the effective range on here, it's effective to almost exactly 1,300, or sorry, 2,000 yards. That's very good. You look at the drop here at 1,000 yards, it has 7.1 mils of drop, which is even slightly better than almost exactly the same, zero point 0.3 less than the 7 mm Magnum. So again, that's something that needs to be pointed out as well. So this is a very, very flat shooting round. It is a ton of power. I mean, you look at whatever, almost 1,700 pounds of energy at 1,000 yards. That's more than a 223 at point blank, right? So that's absolutely insane amount of power. If you're looking, and this is one of the main reasons why I think the American military adopted it, is that you have that combination of a very flat shooting round with a ton of power, like a ton of power. These have insane amounts of knockdown power, but they're a 30 cal bullet. That's why the 30 cals are becoming more popular again, because again, prior to fairly recently, the 300 Norma, the 300 PRC, even the 300 Ultra Mag, those weren't popular rounds. Like, again, if you wanted to do long range shooting up until about 5 years ago or so, almost everybody had 308s. Right now, it's the 300 cals. You have hardly any 7 MMs, and the most popular one is the 6.5s, which again Um, I'll get into soon. But the other one I wanted to point out here is the 300 Win Mag. Now again, why do I bring up the 300 Win Mag? Is because the 300 Win Mag is a lot easier to get your hands on than the 300 Norma, the 300 PRC, the 300 Ultra Mag, which are going to be a little bit better than the 300 Win Mag. But the reason why I bring this up is I wanted to show people that 300 Win Mag, it's only a slight, slightly worse than the 300 Norma or PRC or Ultra Mag. So again, if you look at the 300 Win Mag, this is the 215 grain Burger Hybrid, which is the bullet that the U.S. military uses in the 300 Norma. This one would be slightly slower. I think they're pushing it at like 29 to 3,000 feet a second. So it's only slightly slower. But again, you look at the max supersonic range on this bullet, you're looking at about 1,800 yards, which is absolutely phenomenal. Not to mention too, if you're reloading, you could probably get it a little further as well. I mean, you look at the muzzle energy at 1,000 yards, you're still looking at 1,400 pounds, which is insane. You look at the drop again, 7.5 mils, 7.5 mils. The 300 Norma was what, 7.1? Let's look here. Yeah, 7.1. So again, the drop is fairly comparable. The power is fairly comparable. So again, considering the fact that you could shoot a 300 Win Mag for, especially to start, relatively cheaper. The cases are going to be a lot cheaper to get. The gun or if you're getting a barrel action itself is going to be quite a bit cheaper. Again, so unless you're looking for marginal differences in performance, I would probably go with the 300 Win Mag in the 30 cals, just because it's so much easier to find too, and like I would find it a lot better to be able to find factory ammo than given the fact that 300 Norma on a lot of these other calibers, it's very hard to find factory ammo, and if you do, it's going to be very expensive. So that's why I would probably lean 300 Win Mag, but again, it's up to you. Um, and as far as the best caliber goes, I have the 6.5. Now, there's two main calibers to go over. There's the most popular round in long range shooting right now in the 6.5 Creedmoor, and then there's also the 6.5 PRC. So let's look at the ballistics on here, and then we'll talk a little bit why I think it's the best, even though it isn't the best performing technically. You look at 1,000 yards, you got 8.4 mils of drop. So again, it's not quite as flat shooting as the 7 mm's and the 30 cals. You look at the effective range on it, it's about 1,700 yards. The other thing I need to point out is that the 6.5 PRC is going to get you a little further. So again, the 6.5 PRC is probably going to get you an extra 100 yards. And if you're reloading, this is the thing too, that if you're reloading, a 6.5 PRC is going to get you out to 2,000 yards, and it's going to get you a little more power than the 6.5 Creedmoor. So again, why do I have the 6.5 Creedmoor as the number one round? Well, to me, I would set a very honest tiebreaker here, in that if you're looking to buy a gun and you want to use it for hunting as well, like long range hunting, or even just hunting in general, whatever, I would probably lean one of these other two calibers, whether it's the 30 cals or the 7 mm. But if you're just using a gun for target shooting, I would go with the 6.5 Creedmoor. And the why is that is that you should be able to get as much range as you actually need. Like you don't, in my mind, there's no real reason, at least other than just to say you're doing it, or just to say you can, to shoot past like 1,500 yards. Like that, it's just to say you can do it kind of territory at that point. There's no real world scenario where you're actually going to be doing that, regardless of whether it's hunting or SHTF. I don't care what it is. It's the chances of it happening are incredibly likely. So, and not to mention too, 6.5 Creedmoor of all these rounds is the easiest to get your hands on, and it's the cheapest by quite a bit. Like quite a bit. Like you can get decent quality or even good quality factory match ammo for 6.5 for like $1.50 to $2 a shot. And again, I'm quoting Canadian numbers, so again, Americans, you guys probably have it better than we do. Um, if you're looking at any of these other calibers, aside from 308, but let's forget about 308 because it's not in the top three. Any of the 30 cals, any of the 7 mm, you're looking at least $3 to $4 a shot minimum, right? That's minimum. $3 minimum, probably 4 or 5, upwards of 6. So if you're looking for something that's going to be cheap, not cheap, just not going to absolutely destroy you. Like, if you have an unlimited budget, then by all means. But again, for most people, being able to pick up a box of good quality match ammo for 35 bucks compared to, which is about what you're looking at Canadian, maybe 30 to 40, depending on, if it's on sale, where it's at, all that kind of stuff, compared to 80 to 100. That's a very large difference. Like, that's a very large difference. And not to mention too, a 6.5 Creedmoor is going to be a lot easier to shoot, especially if you have a muzzle brake. If you have a muzzle brake, the felt recoil on a 6.5 is going to be very minimum. It is going to make it a lot easier to spot your own shots, which is something that a lot of beginners, it's very hard to do, and that's to long range shooting, is that you need to be able to spot your shots, because if you miss, you want to know where you missed, adjust, and so you can learn why you missed. Now, again, if you have a big honkin' 338 Lapua or 50 BMG, that's going to be very, very hard to do, regardless of how trained you are. Even some of these big 300 cals. Now, if they have a muzzle brake, that'll help a little bit, but you're still going to have quite a bit of recoil, even if you have a muzzle brake on a 300 Norma. Now, again, it's not going to destroy your shoulder or anything, but it's still going to be, you're still going to notice it. 6.5 with a muzzle brake, that's very, very little recoil. So that's, I think, the main reasons why, at least if your main goal is target shooting, 6.5 is the way to go. Now, again, if you want to shoot a deer at 1,000 yards with a 6.5, you still have 846 pounds of energy. That's enough. That's enough energy to take a deer. Um, because again, 500 yards, you got almost 1,500 pounds of energy. So again, it's not that you can't do it; it's just not ideal. I mean, you look at the 300 Norma, you have 2,600 pounds of energy at 500 yards. Now that's almost as much as the 308 at point blank, right? So this is the other problem, that if you're going to use these calibers for hunting, I mean, you're going to destroy a deer. I mean, if you're looking at elk or moose, that's probably more ideal. But even if you shoot an elk at a couple hundred yards, it's still overkill with these 300 Norma, 300 Ultra Mags, and these kind of guns. So um, that is kind of my thoughts. I know a lot of people would disagree, but I think everybody would agree that the best calibers are the 300s, the 6.5s, and the 7mm. Specifically 7mm Magnum, because it's pretty much your only option. I think it's not even debatable that those are the best three. I think the debate is which one specifically, and I think another big problem that will come up is that there's constantly new calibers being introduced. Like I say, if you got into this game 10 years ago, pretty well everybody had a 308. Like the 6.5 Creedmoor was just coming onto the scene, 300 Norma and the 300 PRC. A lot of these guns, like they didn't even exist. Nobody had them, right? Now the 308 is aside from practicing, it's irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant. So this is the thing that you may have the best caliber right now, but 5 years ago, or sorry, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there may be a new one that blows it out of the water, right? Because you look at every single one of these three examples blows the 308 out of the water. 10 years from now, we may even have that much better yet. And again, I think we're going to get diminishing returns, but I think within 10 years, we're probably going to have one that's even better. And the reason why is that these bullet manufacturers, the Burgers and the these companies, that Burgers and Hornady, and I'm completely blanking on all the other ones. Sierra, these high-end bullet manufacturers, they've gotten so much better over the past. Like like this bullet, like the 215 Burger Hybrid, they didn't exist 10 years ago. This 225 grain Hornady match round, though that didn't exist either, right? So again, I think that we're constantly going to be coming up with better and better bullets, and I think that's one of the reasons why these calibers are getting that much more and more effective. So that's another thing to keep in mind too, is that you may think that, oh, I'm getting this because it's the best that exists, but 10 years from now it won't be. So that's another thing people need to keep in mind. But anyway, that is my thoughts. Again, if you liked the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.